time now for Perspective. From Geert Wilders to Marine Le Pen and from Viktor Orban to Matteo Salvini, the figureheads of European populism have been making waves at the ballot box in recent years. Today's guest has been taking a closer look at how we can pinpoint and pigeonhole such movements. The political sociologist Matthijs Rooduijn joins us now from Amsterdam. Thank you very much for being with us here on France 24. Now, there's a very important first question I want to ask you, and that is, what is your precise definition of populism?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. I see populism as a message in which the good people, according to which the good people, the virtuous people, is betrayed or corrupted or whatever negative by an evil elite, a corrupt evil elite. So it's really about the antagonistic relationship between the good people and the evil elite. And this definition, it's important to emphasize that this is the definition of populism because it's something different from what many people call nativism. So the message that there is a native group that is threatened by immigrants or people of another race, people of another religion. Populism is about the relationship between the people and the elite, and something what we might call nationalist exclusionism or nativism. That's something else. That's about the in-group versus the out-group, like immigrants. And what we see when we talk about politicians like Le Pen, like Orban, like Wilders in my country, we see that they combine both messages. So they're both nativist and populist.
But when we say populist, does that mean the extremes of the political spectrum at each occasion?
Populism is often encountered on the extremes of the political spectrum. So we see that far-right parties tend to be populist, far-left parties tend to be populist, but not necessarily so. We have far-left parties that are not populist, and we have more mainstream parties in the center of the political ideological spectrum that are also populist. An example of a party, a very successful party nowadays that is not really far-left or far-right is the Five Star Movement in Italy, for example. That's a strongly populist party, but it's not, I would say, a party that is far-left or far-right.
Is there a link, in your view, between the populism that we've detected here in Europe and the populism that we see elsewhere in the world?
Yes, there are differences. So in general, populism is the same all over the world. So populism really is about the good people versus the evil elite. But exactly how this populist message is filled in, that differs from case to case. And what we see is that when you look at Europe in particular, far-right parties, far-right populist parties have been successful and are still really successful. If you look, for instance, at Latin America, there we can see that far left-wing populism is really successful. Of course, that's changing now when we look at Brazil, for instance. But in general, you can see that regions of the world have their own types of populism. But not exclusively so. So in Latin America, you have left and right-wing populism. In Europe, you have left and right-wing populism. But the emphasis tends to differ between regions of the world and also between different countries.
Now, you've been busy putting together this study on populism. Have your findings been in any way contested, or is the chart that you've put together the best way of measuring populism?
I'm not sure if it's the best way of measuring populism. What we did in collaboration with The Guardian, they, I have to say, made these beautiful graphs. What I did, I classified parties as being either populist or not populist. And I think that can be a very fruitful approach, but at the same time, that's a very difficult and problematic approach because parties can be more or less populist. So there are many borderline cases, parties for which it's really difficult to assess if they are populist or not, because they're somewhere in the middle. They endorse the message that there's an evil elite that corrupts the virtuous people. They endorse that message to some extent, but they do not really very strongly emphasize that message. So there were some borderline cases, and that makes it really problematic. However, in the end, I think that the parties that we came up with that were classified as populist, some of them are, of course, disputed, but many of them are not. And I think when you look at the graphs that came out of it, so you can see that the success of populism, both far left and far right populism in Europe, has strongly increased in the last 20 years. I think that very few scholars would dispute that general message.
Now, we all love to bask in the idea that we live in some form of a democracy, in Europe at least. Is there anything wrong with voters showing their support for such populist movements in a healthy democracy?
Well, populism, there is a very important discussion about whether populism is something good or whether it's something bad. I think that it has both good and bad sides. There is a very good thing about populism, and the very good thing is that populist parties tend to put on the agenda issues that have long been neglected by the established parties. For instance, until 2 decades ago, for instance, issues like immigration, European unification, that were not really very important among the ruling political parties. However, many citizens thought that these issues were important. Populist parties have given voice to these worries of citizens, and it basically means that there are citizens now that before were not really or did not feel represented by political parties. They now do feel represented by parties, and I think that's good news for democracy. On the other hand, we live in liberal democracies, and in particular, when you look at right-wing, far-right populists, what they argue is often not really compatible with the foundations of liberal democracy. For instance, when it comes to minority rights, when it comes to checks and balances, this is something that far-right populist parties are not really happy about. They see it as liabilities to quite some extent.
Matthijs Rooduijn, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for being with us for today's perspective. Thank you very much.